The concept of race and of human races is energetically, spiritually, and thus scientifically inaccurate. And I'd like to debunk exactly how inaccurate it is. First of all, the mindset that governs most Anglophone countries regarding the notion of 3 or 5 major race groups is a thinking pattern that we've inherited from early European colonialism and its accompanying stupidity and narrow-mindedness. It has been proved to hold no scientific merit, and it also happens to be spiritually void. We regard observable physical differences in people as significant and defining because of how visually striking they are to the naked eye. However, scientifically, these differences are a result of environmental adaptiveness and represent only a small percentage of the human genome. These physical features are a result of the human body adapting to its environment to better survive it. And yet, for instance, something that we consider particularly, such as skin tones, is influenced by a single gene in the human genome, and different skin pigmentation are caused by a single tweak in that gene. When put into perspective, it seems completely insignificant, but because the result that it provokes are visually striking, we all pay great attention to it, even though it's not that significant. And again, on the scale, the human race is 99.9% the same genetically speaking, even though culturally and socially we've been led to believe otherwise, and the importance that's been placed on skin color is far too disproportionate in comparison to the facts. And here is a fun fact: there is no such thing as a homogeneous black race, because there is actually more ethnic diversity in Africa than there is on any other continent on the planet. What truly does exist in the world is ethnicity and ethnic diversity, not race. And by that I hear a group of people who share the same ancestry, not race. There is remarkably so little diversity because science reflects the energy currents of the universe and of the human race. And that is all because as human beings we are all born equal. And whether or not this fundamental fact is actually applied in practice, whether it's socially or culturally, or whether it's upheld legally, that doesn't change. This is still a fact and we are still all equal. It's a fact that is specifically inherent to the human race because of something called basic human dignity. That human dignity demands that essentially our humanity be recognized and acknowledged. And that is something that calls for basic human respect. We are all equal in the sense that we have all of us in us that same spark of life that needs to be, again, acknowledged and respected, which I think is a basic fact that a lot of people, not just me, obviously, have recognized and understood. And again, it really doesn't matter whether or not this fact is recognized. It doesn't matter if a person has contradictory and conflicting beliefs. It doesn't change. This is still a fact, which is why effectively, when you think that some people are less equal than others, unless you're speaking about the illusion of the social ladder, then you are in fact wrong, you're in fact mistaken, and you do not have an opinion, you just do not hold all the facts. The facts remain, again, that regardless, nevertheless, nonetheless, we are all human, all of us. And that is precisely why we take issue against crimes against humanity being committed, precisely because we can sense, we all know deep down inside that it has no spiritual basis. So when considering all these facts, both spiritually and scientifically, how is it that we end up with a world that is somehow so governed by racism? What's important to understand here is that the concept of racism was created for the sake of convenience. Racism was invented as an excuse. So from the 1600s and the 1900s, there was something called indentured servitude. So the idea was that one person would sell themselves to another and perform free labor for a defined period of time. That exchange was upheld by a legal contract, and what would incite a person to sell themselves into indentured servitude was A, usually legal reasons such as clearing out debts, and B, as a way to travel to America, to the newly discovered America, because people couldn't afford the travel cost. That way they traveled for cheap in exchange of work. And so, at first, the majority of indentured servants were actually European. However, the discovery of America by Europeans and its colonization also coincided with the discovery of Africa and also its colonization. And so originally, before being forced into slavery, Africans were actually brought over to be indentured servants. Now, the distinction, however minor in this context, is that an indenturee would work for a certain period of time, and after that period of time was over, they would actually be released from that contract. And there are actually some records of black people being given land to live on. Oh, and coincidentally, do you know who was actually forced into indentured servitude before Africans? That's right, Native Americans, of course. So initially it seems that Africans were forced into slavery and indentured servitude both, but gradually what happened is that after a while, slaves came cheaper than indentured servants, and the concept of indentured servitude gradually died out. And so this is where racism comes into play. In order to justify slavery, religious beliefs were fabricated as an excuse. So two things were used. First, the idea that the color white represented good and the color black was a representation of evil was used against black. And it's really in this moment that you can see the emergence of blacks versus whites, precisely because, as I've already explained, and as other people have explained before me, there is no basis for blacks versus whites, because reality is a lot more complex than that. The idea was born out of generalization, ignorance, and convenience. And the second factor involved differentiating between Christians and non-Christians, and when met with religious diversity, it was ruled out as heresy. And people who were non-Christians in their homeland were essentially denied their human rights on this basis. It suited colonists who needed workers for their farms and their estates and whatnot to justify their usage of slavery. It was a convenient excuse to mark people as different, not to have to regard them as human beings and afford them their basic human rights, the same rights that they would demand for themselves, the same freedoms that they would demand for themselves. Racism and racist ideologies were created to justify slavery. There are two anecdotes that I'd like to share concerning perceptions of race across the globe. As you may know, Japan is a country that is ethnically homogeneous, more than most countries. There are a few factors that play into this ethnical homogeneity, but the point is that it goes way back and stems from Japanese mythology. Much like the Western world, Japan had its own version of the divine rights of kings, and the imperial line was believed to be the descendant of a goddess called Amaterasu. And so historically and culturally, Japanese people did not just perceive themselves as one ethnic group, they perceived themselves as one race. That race was dubbed the Yamato, which is incidentally the name of the imperial line. They had a sense of supremacy derived from this belief, and it's that sense of supremacy, it's this belief that was used to justify invading Korea in earlier centuries. And it's also that sense of supremacy that was used to justify invading Korea again and the entire South Pacific during World War II. That belief was actually completely crushed later on by America post-surrender after World War II. But what's interesting about this case is that despite being a highly isolated country, despite being so closed off, Japan ultimately had the exact same logic as the rest of the world, where it would place a certain group of individuals high on the social ladder and would help justify it with so-called divinity. And it not only goes to show that the human race is the same wherever you go on the planet, but it also shows that whenever you implement the idea of racial superiority in anyone's mindset, in anyone's thinking patterns, you end up with crimes against humanity, which is pretty much like what is happening right now in America and what has been happening in America since the 1800s. And the second anecdote I wanted to share concerns Africa. So unlike Europe, the borders in Africa are actually incredibly unnatural looking. They don't look so organic. They have these strange square shapes. When you look at a European map, you can see that the borders look rather organic in a sense. They look natural. They represent the migration patterns of the human race. Unlike, for instance, a map of Europe or of Asia, the borders in Africa have these unnatural, non-organic looking shapes that are very squarey, very rectangular shapes, which is coincidentally something that you can also see on the map of America and North America in general. You can tell that colonialism went there. The reason for that is that when France and Great Britain and all these European countries went in Africa and decided to colonize the place, they pretty much cut up the country according to their own convenience. And the reason for the borders being drawn up this way is that when France and Great Britain and other European countries came to colonize Africa, they essentially divided the continent according to what was convenient for them. Those unnatural-looking borders go against the delimitations created by the communities that originally lived there, and those borders were representative of the ethnic communities that lived there. Those unnatural-looking borders go against the delimitations that were created by the groups, by the ethnic communities that already lived there prior to colonization. Historically, and up until today, Africa is actually highly ethnically diverse. And as I've mentioned just before, there is more ethnical diversity on this continent than there is in any other continent and in any other ethnic groups. And while ignorant thinking often reduces the entire continent and their African American counterparts to the term black people, in truth, reality is, well, less black and white than that. There existed and still exist today different ethnic communities in Africa. The core of the issue of racism lies in the perception that people have of race. A majority of people in Anglophone countries seem to perceive humanity as us versus them, as blacks versus whites, and so in a literally black and white way. And at the core of this belief is the erroneous nonsense that is racial superiority. And while socially that vision translates into a selected group of individuals having their human rights upheld, while other individuals have those rights denied to them, that us versus them mentality is incredibly reductive, narrow-minded, and most importantly, as we've already seen, inaccurate. And so a more accurate depiction would look a little bit like this. The truth is that humans are an extremely fluid group of beings where none stand above the other. The ethnic reality is a lot more diverse than a single digit of major race groups. And within these falsely perceived major groups, there is usually a wealth of diversity to be found. The terms black and white people are reductive. Black people are not one race. White people are not one race. Asians are not one race. We are all ethnic human groups that constitute humanity, that constitute the human race. The human race as a whole is one group comprised of ethnic diversity. The reason why there is so much violence and bigotry in the world is precisely because most people, most humans, are not up to date with this universal knowledge. Because people do not see and they do not understand that we are all one race, one group. It creates division, it creates this us versus them mentality, it leads to dehumanization, and it pits people against each other because they do not know, because they are ignorant that there is no other race beside the human race. And the human race is comprised of several different ethnic groups and of a vast amount of ethnic diversity. The idea that there is a difference between peoples, aside from a shallow difference, needs to disappear, it needs to end for the violence to end. Because it's when people understand that we are all the same, that we are all made of the same human energies, that we are all made of the same energy currents, that false perceptions of superiority and divisions can finally end. It's only the day that people will be spiritually evolved enough to understand this truth instinctively, to understand it naturally, that finally all of this bullshit can end.